Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started with today's session. So welcome to our speaker series, and on behalf of the Cross-Border Institute here at the University of Windsor, I'd like to welcome you. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Laurie Tannous. I'm a special advisor at the Cross-Border Institute, work with Dr. Bill Anderson and Marta Lierdi Anderson and the rest of the team who are all here today. I am an immigration and international trade lawyer is my background, and I'm also the Vice President of Government Relations at FARO, which is a customs broker. So today we're going to be talking about all different dynamics with respect to the border, and we've got our special guest here, Dan Ujczo from Dickinson Wright, all the way from Ohio. Dan is an international trade and customs attorney, specializes in Canada-U.S. matters, and really is a subject matter expert on anything NAFTA. So just to give you a bit of background in terms of the Cross-Border Institute, we at the Institute focus on the research, the education, and the outreach with respect to anything that crosses the border, so movement, goods, services, and we really try to focus on the policy aspects, the governance aspects, and then how technology can also improve and facilitate things at border crossings globally, not just here in Canada and the U.S. So with, as I'm sure you're all following the media and the stories that we're hearing about the renegotiation of NAFTA, we thought it was important to bring this important subject to your attention through the speaker series. So the speaker series here at the Cross-Border Institute is a continuation of some reports that we've been producing that are out there on the desk, so please help yourself to them. The How It Works and Why It Matters series. So we've got one on the binational advantage between Canada and the U.S., and then another one in terms of the TN visa program in the U.S. and how that really works. So the combination of the reports in the speaker series, we're really just trying to get as much relevant and accessible information to you as possible as it relates to borders. And just to level set in terms of what we're talking about here, there's approximately $1.8 billion of trade that crosses the Canada-U.S. border on a daily basis, and half of that trade is between Ontario and the U.S. So in terms of the importance of our role here and in this province altogether. And at the Ambassador Bridge, there's about 7,000 trucks that cross daily. So just to give you some numbers with respect to that. So Dan, I know that you're flying out later tonight to head to Washington. Can you tell us what you're going to be doing up there?
Talk about my family vacation.
Yeah.
No, actually, as we speak, it's all about the topics and targets of the NAFTA modernization. So, in May, when the U.S. announced that it wanted to modernize the NAFTA, it announced stakeholder consultations that have been going on for the past month and change. A little bit of feedback here. I'm loud generally, so I'm probably breaking the machine. So those comments were submitted in writing a few weeks ago, as you know, and frankly there were so many comments that it was scheduled to end at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time on a Monday night a couple weeks ago, and they had to extend that period to Thursday to account for the volume. Just the system didn't quite crash, but they wanted to allow more time. Also frustrated a lot of us that were up all weekend doing these things, and we could have had more days. But and then a number of folks that wanted to testify in person are doing so in front of the U.S. Trade Representative, USTR, right now. It started yesterday. They have 130-odd witnesses right now. So they started yesterday. They went all marathon session yesterday, marathon session as we speak. And then we'll have another one tomorrow, and I'll be down there for a few sessions testifying. They were gracious enough to block it in one day for me, so which was nice. No, it's kind of the folks that are talking about Canada-U.S. are there putting out their ideas. So that's where the process is right now, all of which is leading to an announcement by the U.S. government of what its specific negotiating topics will be, which has to be issued 30 days before any negotiation formally starts. So we'll see that. So the so-called 30-day letter. The 90-day letter was the one in May that you had to announce the renegotiation, then you have 90 days to start. So that really put us no sooner than August. And then there'll be the 30-day letter. So if you're staying with the August time frame, we should be looking at mid-July at some point where the U.S. has to outline those specific negotiating objectives. So now is the time for the U.S. business community, but Canadians and Mexicans and everybody else for that matter were welcome to submit comments. So they're listening. So there's a stakeholder consultation process. Canada has its going on right now as well. So Canada's, they haven't scheduled formal hearings, but that process will go from basically now until mid-July, timed almost precisely with the date that we expect the U.S. to be out there. So.
And what are your thoughts on what the U.S. is really going to be focusing on? Do you have any, are you hearing any rumblings? I know you've got good intel typically in terms of what's happening in Washington. What's your gut feeling in terms of what the areas are that they're going to be really tackling?
Well, I think when we look at what's happening in the NAFTA modernization process, we've been talking about it in terms of the T's, all around the letter T's. I have a 6-year-old, so everything is about T's and letters and numbers, and the topics and targets are what we've all wanted to know really since day one. Where is the focus going to be? And there's no, I don't want to say there's no great mystery there, but we know it's, and you just look at the hearings, how they've played out and what we've seen in the media. On day one it was textiles, footwear, et cetera, so the retail side of things, which are a large issue, particularly, not so much between Canada and the United States, but global trade in Mexico in particular. Agriculture was pretty much most of the day yesterday, followed immediately by technology, intellectual property. And I don't necessarily mean to suggest that the flow of the hearings tells you where the issues are, but it certainly shows you where the buckets are areas of focus. They were listed in the Federal Register notice, so you had a number of topics there all listed. But it's in today's manufacturing day, construction day, anything heavy, steel, aluminum, all of those things are today, and then tomorrow are basically stakeholders and other trade associations. But where the Federal Register notice was, its rules of origin are clearly a target in two ways. I think one that's very positive is that a lot of the rules of origin are old. They don't exist anymore in today's space. The NAFTA's got some dust on it. It's 20 odd years and change. So there's a cleanup that needs to be done. The other is that when we take a step back for a moment, when you look at what U.S. trade policy is, everybody's focused on President Trump. But his trade team are folks that have been around this business for a long time. Our U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, he's been talking about these issues at least for 25 years. In the same way, in the same speeches, and he's an ex-steel warrior. He was in the steel in terms of working for U.S. Steel as a lawyer or on a law firm on their behalf. You're seeing, prior to that, in the Reagan administration, where he was known to be the person that introduced voluntary export restraints to Japan. Of course, we all remember the movies of the 1980s, Gung Ho and others. The Japanese were coming and taking over Windsor and Youngstown and Cleveland and Detroit and everywhere else. It turned out that actually turned out to be a pretty good advantage for places like Honda and Toyota and Alliston and things like that that are happening throughout North America. But Bob Lighthizer, our USTR, basically used other levers of influence in the U.S. government to say, we don't necessarily need to bring a trade case. We have we're going to make it so you voluntarily stop doing things. And his fights with China, as is Secretary Ross, as is the trade warriors that have come into the administration. And when we look at that, how does that apply here? It's China and its proxies too, so Vietnam, Malaysia, elsewhere. And what they want to make sure is that our rules of origin don't allow goods to come in to the North American space, into Canada, Mexico, and then Mexico in particular, and then come in duty-free into the United States. The one anecdotal story we repeatedly hear from the administration is the piece of steel from China that goes to Japan, that then is exported to Mexico, then becomes an exhaust pipe that then is NAFTA duty-free. Most folks will say that anecdotal story. In our law firm, Dickinson Wright, we were founded in Detroit in the 1870s. We founded Chrysler. We incorporated Chrysler. I shouldn't say founded. We incorporated Chrysler. I mean, we've been in the auto business a long time, and our companies have said that's actually not true. That story is not a very accurate story in terms of how that piece comes in. But it's one of those pieces of anecdotal information that's shaping the discussion. So what you'll see is a tightening of rules of origin, not so much to target Mexico and the United States, but to stop things coming in through the back door. And we've seen Mexico respond to that. Mexico finished its consultation period back in May, and they've said there's about 3% of goods that come in from China and elsewhere into Mexico and come in, and they're willing to look at tightening up those rules of origin. The issue for the business community is when you start doing that, how many companies in Windsor, or particularly out in Western Canada, but really throughout our supply innovation and value chains, rely on those low-cost goods from overseas that actually are part of the larger manufacturing supply chain that creates jobs here. So what are the disruptive effects of that? And I think that's the unknown animal. So you see positions on all sides of that issue. And look, if I'm a company, look, I'm a private sector lawyer, if I'm a company and I hear rules of origin are on the table, why wouldn't I try to tighten those up to my advantage as a US, Canadian, or Mexican company, right? I mean, you can't fault the private sector for wanting to do that. Why wouldn't you try to do that in that discussion? So there's always special interest is known as a pejorative, but that's how democracy works, right? I mean, special interest, that's why everybody should put their issues on the table and policymakers have to make those decisions. So that's a very long introduction. Rules of origin is one. The digital chapter on things like intellectual property, but technology, many of the technological devices, internet, there's more power in our cell phones here than most computers had when the NAFTA came into being. So how do you put a digital chapter into the NAFTA? I think that's clearly on the list, and that should be, in relative terms, pretty easy to do. We negotiated a lot of that in the Trans-Pacific Partnership discussions. So I think we can talk about the politics of that, cutting and pasting from the TPP and sticking it in the NAFTA, but that's clearly an issue. Agricultural supply management, and I don't think it's supply management as a program that's in question. It's how do we find opportunities for those special interests? How do we deal with some of the issues? I mean, we were just with the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture in Toronto, and his message was, we're not arguing with supply management. It's that if you're going to have supply management, then manage your supply, meaning that if milk is ultra-filtered milk is used in cheese and other types of things, and the waste product, don't dump it back out into the market so that further depresses prices. Manage the supply. Because on agriculture, the U.S. itself, we're not ready to completely open up our agricultural sectors. We can talk more about how Mexico's used that to its advantage in a moment as well. So, I think those are the big issues. Unfortunately, I think the issues that small, medium-sized enterprises really care about, movement of workforce across borders, that's going to be a very difficult issue in the U.S.
On that, let me ask you, you and I are practitioners in this field and see the frustrations of companies on a day-to-day basis just trying to get their employees across the border. What are your thoughts on whether or not the NAFTA list or even just immigration policy from a global mobility perspective, from a professional perspective, how much of that do you think is actually going to be discussed or tackled? I didn't see it in depth the way that I would have liked to have seen it. I know you've said the same thing, so what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, to me, this will be a significant missed opportunity if we don't address that issue. We're not talking about movement of refugees. We're not talking about movement of undocumented migrants. We're not even talking about movement of agricultural workers at this point, which are critical to a lot of our states in the U.S. Midwest and Southwestern Ontario as well. What we are talking about are folks that work for companies that are just trying to get to the operations on the other side of the border, or technology companies that, quite frankly, we're not talking about the movement. Most of your tech companies aren't moving a good or service or good. They're moving the service. They're moving what's up here to go to meetings or raise venture capital. Again, that didn't exist in the mid-1990s, and then, of course, before that in the 1980s. So what we really are dealing with, I think, across the board in the NAFTA and free trade agreement is this evolution of North American integration in terms of trade. And our companies have done exactly what was intended in 1994. We've optimized. We're looking at our supply chains. We're going where there's best value. Now the thing is, now that our companies are spread across our three borders, we can't move the people because the system hasn't been updated that long for political and other reasons. So I think there's the potential for a carve-out where I don't think we call it immigration, first of all. That's a terrible term in the U.S. politically. I think it's increasingly become here in Canada. What we're talking about is moving our workforce between Canada and the United States. I don't think this was on the U.S. trade team's radar when they really came in following the inauguration. It's also not something trade lawyers generally talk about. We don't really care too much about immigration's kind of what the lawyers on the other side of the office do, right? But it's a key driver for investment decisions. Am I going to be able to allow my employees to get there? You know, you talk to any company that wants to invest here in Windsor, whether they're foreign or just even domestic, you talk to any company in that state across the river or in Ohio or places like that, you know, their number one question isn't what tax incentives am I going to get? Right now, it's do you have a workforce that can supply not only the skills, but am I able to locate here? Am I going to have employees to actually hire? The question in the U.S., and particularly in the U.S., but even in Canada right now, isn't do we have jobs? There's enough jobs to go around. It's just we don't have the people to fill them right now. And you look at something here, one of our greatest challenges right now, we can't get tool and die workers anywhere in our automotive supply chain right now. So, and they exist in pockets here in Windsor and over here, but companies, when they set up shop, they want to move those folks around for spot projects or other things. You know, you're one of the top immigration lawyers around here. You can't move them. And it's painful as a lawyer when you say, I've looked at every possible solution for you, including you setting up operations on each side and everything else. Because companies will say, just tell us what we have to pay. Just tell us what we have to pay to get our bodies across because we need this particular skill set and we can't do it. I think, again, if we talk about it more in terms of workforce and investment attraction, I also think, you know, one of the areas that we've talked a lot about is a digital business visitor, meaning, for example, I don't think we need to reopen. So immigration has to do with, there's business visitors, which all of us that cross the Canada-U.S. border are pretty familiar with. You're allowed to cross to go to movies, or you can go to sales calls, you can go to meetings I can come across allegedly for meetings with my law partners. As long as I'm criminally admissible, I can, you know, come over as a business visitor and not require a work permit. And then as you go up the scale of activity, there's certain visas, and then there's the NAFTA visa, which applies for lawyers, engineers, other professionals that are a list of categories, and then there's companies that actually do set up shop and those types of things. My view is I think we can clear out a lot of the business travel issues just by dealing with the business visitor. There's a lot of talk, let's reopen that NAFTA list. I have a big issue with that. The minute you reopen the NAFTA list and start creating a listing of jobs that we want to allow to cross the Canada-U.S. border, it will be outdated the day you create it.
So can I play devil's advocate for a minute? What are your thoughts then on the CETA's use of a negative list?
Yeah, or the positive list,
Right.
which is pretty much we allow everybody in.
We allow everybody, but, right.
It could be a way to go. I'm just not sure that the U.S. is ready for that right now. I think that would be a tough road to hoe in the U.S. political system, is to say, and problematic on that is that we have a third partner on the continent. I think the idea that we would be allowing professionals of all, particularly from Mexico, I'm not suggesting it's right or wrong from my own perspective. I'm just saying I think politically that would be a tough sell. There's also something called the Sensenbrenner rule in the U.S. where it gets misinterpreted, where if you're going to talk about immigration in a trade agreement, Congress has to specifically authorize that. And there's a question whether USTR can talk about immigration on this right now. My view of it is actually we can, given the authority granted to Congress on this. We can come back to Trade Promotion Authority in a minute. But I think that would be tough. I think let's deal with what we can right now and maybe come up with other avenues to deal with that. For example, you know, my view, I don't want to give away what we're trying to do here too much, but you know, we're all family here, but the idea would be how do you embed mobility provisions into other areas? So if you're going to build a digital chapter, if you're going to put a digital chapter in, it better have a mobility provision in it, meaning, and you know this, you're a former CBSA officer, you know, most of business visitors are not a statute or a law. You hear a lot, well, Congress has to pass a law or Parliament has. It's not. It's field manuals that CBSA and USCBP use to determine who's a business visitor, what's a sales call, all those other types of things. What we need to do is upgrade those to the modern. And I think we would clear out, I don't have hard data on this, and that's something maybe CBI is where its great work is done, is to take a look at, you know, how much would we clear out with a business visitor? I think it would clear out 70% of the problems that I see as a lawyer every day. And then we can deal with that class of employees that need to move. The one issue on the NAFTA list is management consultants. Management and consultant is a category that you're permitted to receive a visa for. to travel between Canada and the United States, it's strongly disfavored by immigration authorities and CBSA and US CBP in particular. They just don't like it because anybody can call themselves a manager or a consultant. Well, the fact is, compare 1994 to now. Everybody I know is a consultant of some type. You know, I mean, let's think about your family and friends. Everybody's a consultant to somebody, you know, and we could all say that. So the idea is that may be a good workaround too, is rather than changing the list, is expanding the list of who's a manager and consultant.
And I think you and I have talked about this, is that tackling this from a policy perspective and changing policy or improving things, not necessarily opening up that list, right?
I agree.
So you said something, I just want to go back to it, in terms of the business visitor, you know, that category, let's say, for at least from a local perspective, Windsor, Detroit, Great Lakes, Ohio, do you think that that could solve some of the irritants that are happening at the border for companies that are simply just trying to move their people for meetings or for business development or those types of activities? So what impact do you think that could have directly to this region?
Oh, I think it's the greatest challenge that our companies face between Canada and the U.S., particularly in the Great Lakes region, is moving bodies. Our issue is not moving goods across the border right now. Outside of maybe the agriculture, agri-food sector, and that's probably going to get worse over the next few years as we change our regulatory systems. Our problem right now is the border is actually working fairly well in terms of the movement of goods. I mean, there's still work to go. Single window where you're intimately involved on customs brokers. I mean, there's a way to do it better, but we're not seeing a broken border as we did pre-9/11. We're not seeing the delays that we saw. I think, you know, Dr. Anderson, Bill, I actually used one of his PowerPoints. Maybe if I can actually...
Did you get permission from
Maybe if I could... No, I didn't actually, but I show it all the time.
Dan, come on.
Yeah, my trademark or my IP lawyers. But maybe if I can, because we jumped right into it, and I didn't even get to, first of all, thank everybody for being here and point out that I wore my 150th Canada tie. I've been waiting to bring this tie out. I've had it for years. Like, where else do you wear a red and white tie? That's crazy. And I said, it's the 150th birthday. If I can't wear this today or on Christmas for candy canes, when can I? But I do appreciate, again, the opportunity to be here at CBI. But maybe just to frame that, because I talked about the 3 T's, or the 3 buckets of T's, the targets and topics. But one of the things that I do want to touch on is so much of this NAFTA is not going to be shaped on what the issues are. It's going to be shaped on what the tenor and tone of those discussions are going to be. And we saw that in April. These things have a tendency to take a life of their own, particularly in this U.S. administration, where we all knew softwood lumber decision was coming out on April 24. I mean, we've had clients in that for years. We knew the president was going to Wisconsin and ultra-filtered milk. Speaker Ryan had been calling the U.S. Embassy about that in Ottawa for years, or at least since it came out. So had Chuck Schumer, Senator Schumer in New York. And that's their biggest bugaboo. You knew the president was going to bring that up when he was up there.
No secret.
And of course, then the administration also was starting to feel the pressure of the timelines on the NAFTA. So you could see that all snowballing. And all of a sudden, we're in a position where we went from tweak, well, we started at tear it up to tweak, then we went back to tear it up. And it really took Secretary Perdue and Secretary Ross, and as I said, we were with Secretary Perdue, and without betraying confidence, as I asked, how close was that to the president ripping it up before you showed him the map? And, you know, he just smiled, and we all know what that meant, which was, the idea that the president was going to rip up NAFTA was a very real possibility at that point. And in fact, strategically, it wasn't a bad negotiating strategy either, but we can talk about that as well. But, so, what is the tenor and tone over the next few months going to look like between Canada, because softwood's there, you know, we can talk about negotiating with China, countries that are doing those types of, you know, Canada is doing an FTA or trying to do a free trade agreement with China. That's not going to go over real well with the Trump administration. There may be reasons to do that, but domestically. But there's all these other factors that come into play. And then on top of that, I would suggest the most dispositive factor in all of this is the timing and tempo. You know, we are sitting here right now. The administration wants to get this done in August, or start this in August, get it done by the end of the year. That's impossible. If you really want to do anything substantively on the NAFTA, there is no way you get it done before December. And by the way, you can be done with the negotiations by December, but because of the legislation in the U.S. that I'll come back to in a moment, it can't be done. It cannot be done through our consultation process as required by law by spring of next year if we start in August. That's the timeline that we have on the NAFTA. So that puts you right smack dab in the middle of the Mexican elections, And that puts you right smack dab in the U.S. midterm elections, and we can come back and talk about the politics there. So you have timing and tempo, tenor and tone, targets and topics, and all of that's really being driven by the other big T, which is trade promotion authority. Anybody that tells you, oh, we've been through this before with the NAFTA, doesn't really know what they're talking about. We've been around these issues, but the way our system works in the United States is on immigration and trade, both Congress and the President have the authority, arguably, and they have to work together, and that's why both of those issues are a mess. It's the way our Constitution set it up. I don't think maybe they intended it that way, but it's the way that it evolved. So both, the two of our three branches have authority in that area at the beginning, and both will guard that jealously. So what has happened over time is that Congress gives the President the authority to go out through various statutes and negotiate trade agreements, one of which is fast track, which is here's our list of priorities, or trade promotion authority, so-called fast track. And when we say fast track, that's fast in Washington terms, not human people terms. There's nothing fast about fast track, and it's certainly not fast under the current version. So the last round of it, and what fast track means is once the trade agreement's done in the old days, Congress couldn't then do its part, which is go in and add amendments as they do to every bill. We saw it with health care. We're going to see it with health care throughout the month of July and August. That's what Congress does. They go in and put their Lulus, their sweeteners in there, and things that they want onto bill. You can't do that in a trade negotiation because I've just negotiated with you, Canada or Mexico, and now I got to go back, and now my guys, or men and women back home, are going to put these things back on. So fast track means it gets an up and down vote. Here's the agreement. It's done. You vote up and down, and we get the votes in Congress that we want. What happened was when President Obama, keep in mind a Democrat, wanted the Trans-Pacific Partnership done, he went back to a Republican Congress and said, I want TPA. I need trade promotion authority to get this done. And he went to his own party because he needed those votes to get it passed too. And so what you have in Trade Promotion Authority 2015 that was designed for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is what we're using now in the NAFTA, is one of the most extensive consultation periods with Congress that we've ever seen. That's why there was always kind of a 90-day letter and a 30-day letter, et cetera, but they were not enforced to the extent. There are consultations that have to go on with congressional committees. We saw it just last week. The U.S. Trade Representative was in front of congressional hearings, and one of the things that's hanging out there is that our Secretary of Commerce is now saying he's going to get a deal done on softwood lumber before the NAFTA negotiations start. And members of Congress said, sure you are. First of all, the U.S. Trade Representative is the lead negotiator on this, not the Secretary of Congress. And that USTR needs to come and report to us before there's any deal. So what consultations are in the United States and with Congress, it is the quintessential speed bump. It is designed to slow the entire process down. Also under TPA 2015, and we didn't know this. I argued zealously for TPA 2015, but by the time we were trying to get that legislation passed, the Trans-Pacific Partnership had already been negotiated. So we really focused on what are the consultations that have to be once the agreement's reached. And there are some pretty aggressive timelines there because we wanted to get it through. Nobody candidly really focused on what it has to do during the agreement because we didn't plan on having another big one, frankly, other than the agreement that we had with Europe. I got to give the credit to the opposition of the original fast track. They slipped in enough consultations in there where it makes it very hard to get a trade agreement done on any speedy timetable. So that was the big debate. The big debate within the trade community over the winter and spring wasn't really what's going to be in the NAFTA, the targets and topics. We kind of know what those will look like. The question was, is the president going to do, and is the U.S. going to try to do this without trade promotion authority and just do it as the executive branch, meaning they can rip it up or negotiate it or whatever, or are they going to use TPA and go to Congress? And once they chose the congressional route, that sets up a well-prescribed timetable. And so when I said spring of 2018 earlier, that's if we hit every mark as soon as we can. And anybody that watches how our legislative process goes in the U.S., God, it's designed to be slow. I mean, that's what our framers were coming up on the 4th of July here in the U.S. They wanted it to be slow because it's deliberative. It's not quite second sober thought. That's our Senate, but in the House, it's meant to work quite slow. So, So that's something to keep in mind, is that whenever somebody's talking about, well, we did this back in '94, we did this back in '89, nobody's ever done this. We've done pieces and parts. Nobody has gone through this consultation. So in my view, the fun really hasn't even started yet. And so I think the next big date for us on timing and tempo is what happens in July. If that 30-day letter does come out in July, that is supposed to have a level of specificity entering a trade negotiation that we have yet to see in the United States before a trade negotiation starts. Now, so was the 90-day letter, and they got a free pass on that one, in my view. The Democrats rumbled about it a little bit and said this 90-day letter that you guys sent us should have been more specific. In fact, the draft letter had everything but the kitchen sink. It had everything, you know, to the point where it had so much specificity it meant nothing. But I think most of us expected what we saw in May, but a lot of people were saying, well, wait a minute, we thought this was supposed to be really specific. You're supposed to tell us, Congress, what you're going to go negotiate over. You will see them hold the administration's feet to the fire on the 30-day letter.
So you're expecting that we'll see that specificity coming up?
If it doesn't, it may not in its first cut.
Right.
But if it doesn't, I think you will see particularly the Democratic Party and the Republican Party say, we want to know what you're doing on trade. And the committees will do that. We've seen, from my hometown in Youngstown, Ohio, is Tim Ryan, who's a Democratic congressman, who's certainly not pro-trade in a lot of areas, pro-automotive, but not pro-other areas. He was going to take on Speaker Pelosi. He's already come out and said, we want to see some specificity. We've seen kind of the blue-collar caucus in the Democratic Party already challenged the 90-day letter. They're certainly going to be looking for something on the 30-day. And one of the dynamics playing out in the U.S. right now, and something we'll talk about in Washington tomorrow, is if you look at all polling right now in the U.S. public who's against NAFTA, it is white males, 55 and older, who self-describe themselves as Republicans. That's unprecedented. So you have a significant amount, you say white male over 55, you're usually talking about Republicans anyway, but that self-describe themselves as Republicans, they're against trade. You have the blue-collar side, folks in Youngstown and Western PA and Wisconsin, that are already voted for President Trump, likely the first Republican they ever voted for in their life because of trade. They're going to want to see something in that 30-day letter with one important caveat. Everybody's so tired right now. It has been the longest 6 to 7 months of this administration. Everybody's looking to go home for the 4th of July. August recess in Congress comes right after that. So as we saw yesterday, when we get back after this week, everybody will go home for the Independence Day holiday. Senators and congressmen will go back home. They'll do their town halls, and it's going to be all about health care. It'll be all about health care. And then they'll come back and they'll do health care and they'll get the hell out of town. I don't know if that gets beeped on the video or not, but we'll keep it classy here.
You're live.
But we'll keep it classy here. I should be
I told you
you didn't
were
tell
live.
them I need a 10-second
You're
delay.
live.
Not just 5 seconds. I need 10 seconds. If I get a whole string of them going here. But they'll come back, and it may just be fatigue. So, I keep saying watch the 30-day letter. It may not pop in July, but when they get ready to start those negotiations, I think that's where you'll see. Now, Canada has pretty much put its 30-day letter together in the sense when you look at its laundry list of what it's asking for in the consultation period, it includes everything. It includes labor mobility. It includes other areas. So that's kind of the dynamic that's playing on. That's why I have some concerns over the business community strategy on this, and we've raised these in our submissions, and we've raised them in, and we'll raise them tomorrow, is you keep hearing the phrase "do no harm," right?
Everywhere.
First principle, even Secretary Ross says our first principle is do no harm, which who doesn't love do no harm? I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It's what we want our physicians to espouse. It's my parenting philosophy. As long as I don't screw this kid up, he should turn out. I'll feed him, clothe him, and he should be okay. As long as I don't. So do no harm is calm to me. But think about those voters that I just talked about. I just voted for a Republican, not me, but I'm a voter from Youngstown, Ohio, or Pittsburgh, or Cleveland, Detroit. I just voted for a Republican for the first time in my life for a lot of reasons, but trade was one of them. And now I'm being told by somebody from Washington or a guy that looks like me in a suit and an ugly red and white tie, that we're going to do no harm. I'm from those places. When somebody like that says that, you know what that sounds like to us is they ain't going to do nothing for me. Or they're happy with the status quo. And that voter right there, the midterms are right around the corner in the US. That voter right there is going to go searching for a new candidate, likely in the Democratic Party. And I'm not saying this to cast aspersions against, Senator Elizabeth Warren or Senator Bernie Sanders, but people may love their social policy. They ain't good for NAFTA. They're not good for North American trade or that wing of the party. And that doesn't happen in November of 2018. That happens right as the summer starts. You go to your state fairs, county fairs, those candidates that are going to be running in the primaries are out there on the rubber chicken circuit shaking hands.
The barbecues are already being announced right now, so.
Exactly. So, I mean, this is the time where, on a government relations lobbyist side, this is when you're going to those events and spending money in those campaigns to get them when they're young, get them when they're early, So I think by trying to say do no harm, we have to be very careful about that language, because do no harm, we may actually be creating more uncertainty in the system. And then somebody said to me, I said that in Toronto recently at an event of southeastern US states, and somebody from North Carolina came up to me and said, which is a swing state, and said, I can't just see my Republican buddies going for Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders. And he walked away, and it was one of those, like an hour later, I was like, damn, I should have said this. And the response was, we don't have to, because we've already just heard that voter is highly unlikely to support trade anyway. Now, it's not that they're anti-trade, they're anti-NAFTA, because NAFTA to them means immigration. NAFTA means China. That means everything else. So that's an issue as well. So we can actually see in the midterms on trade, if we do nothing, or if we just tweak, that it'll actually create more uncertainty, because people will go to the fringes of those parties. And meanwhile, we have the Mexico elections going on as well. So what do no harm should really mean is we're not going to go backwards. We're not going to go backwards. We're not going to upset 4 or 5 decades of Canada-U.S. integration from the post-World War II to the Auto Pact, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the free trade agreement, and then the NAFTA. We can't bring factories back to Youngstown. We can't bring them back here right now. And I think the business community has been pretty smart in responding to that demand, which is we're not moving. Now, Ford just made their announcement to not go to Mexico, to go to China. I'm not on the inside of that one. I don't know how that decision was made. The optics of that aren't great right now in the current environment. But I think companies that have thought about pulling up stakes are probably putting that on hold for a little bit, or at least waiting on that decision to allow some of this political dynamic to play out. But that's a huge issue. When I talk about the timing and tempo, it's going to be how does the next 6 to 12 months play out politically? And there's 2 ways to look at it. One is what the administration was talking about up until about last week, which is we got to get it done, we got to get it done, we got to get it done, got to get it done by the end of December. I think there's some realism starting to creep in. We heard USTR Lighthizer say last week, we've never put out a timetable. And I think because they recognize there's the political consequences. For me, politically, I think there's a very simple answer. I think the U.S. is scheduled to host the North American Leaders Summit, the Three Amigos Summit, this year. Right now, I don't even think they've picked the date. I would doubt it actually happens. But what I would do is say, we need time to get this NAFTA done. All you got to do is show the voters that you're actually trying to do something. Hold your nows not in, let me rephrase, hold your Three Amigos Summit not in Miami or Baja, California, LA. Hold it in Detroit. Hold it in Cleveland. I'll make a plug, hold it in Youngstown, Ohio, and get those leaders there rolling up their sleeves. They'll do the typical where they come in their blue shirt. The president will probably come in an extra long tie, But they roll up their sleeves and show that they're doing something, right? And the president loves Wendy's anyway. You know what I mean? Wendy's and McDonald's. Have that as the meal instead of the ornate. Show the working man and woman in the U.S. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying politically that sells. Here's the other issue, though, Laurie, on do no harm, is the business community can't wait around for a tweak. And this is where I do disagree with some of the folks in the various large trade associations, which is, let's just get past this moment. The politics aren't there. We have to wait to fix. We can fix NAFTA later. It's really not that big of a deal. All data, economic data, shows that the NAFTA essentially tapped out depending on how you count, by the late 1990s. You saw the Congressional Research Service just put out a report on me. And by the way, I've been showing a slide that says that, which I borrowed from somebody else. I don't even know who it is, but I've been showing it for years. Because what it shows, and we can talk about this in the context of CBI, is we were doing it in the mid-last part of the last decade, is we wanted to show the impact of border security measures and how that hurt the economy. And you see a dip. You see from 94, the economy goes up between Canada, U.S., and Mexico. You see 9/11, where many of us lost family and friends, and certainly in the conflicts afterwards, and you just see the economy tail, and then the recession comes and it drops out. And the pointy head crowd can argue about what all the reasons are for that, but it's clear there was an impact on border security.
For sure.
What we always talk about, and you and I have done enough of these, where it also leveled out about 1998, where that growth leveled out. And nobody could figure out why for a long time. Was it the recession in Asia, the Tigers recession, was it other things? No, it was because NAFTA had pretty much been fully implemented by that point. So there wasn't a lot left to do to get those gains. And that's what the Congressional Research Service just shows. Their study, if you read it, it says one soundbite out of it is the NAFTA hasn't created much, or eliminating the NAFTA wouldn't do much harm to the economy, would not affect job growth in the U.S. That is not a great headline, by the way. If I'm a congressional staffer and I'm flooded and I pick up that report, it's like, hey, why do we care about this? If we get rid of it, it's not going to hurt job growth. Now, you have to dig into it to realize what it says is we had these significant gains in that they essentially leveled out. And in Canada, U.S., it shows that it largely leveled out before the NAFTA came into force. Most of the gains of the free trade agreement came during the free trade agreement days. Now, economists can argue that, and the Peterson Institute and Gary Huffbauer and the gang down in Washington, are always trying to figure out the exact percentage. But the bottom line is we've needed a new round of NAFTA for a decade and a half. And so we can't just say we're going to tweak it because we started with the targets and topics. Those are the issues we have to address. And let me just offer perspective. I've been doing Canada-U.S. for 20 years, if not longer now, on both the U.S. side and the Canadian side. I have absolutely no confidence that if we let this moment pass, that we'll ever have the opportunity, at least in my generation, to come back and fix it. The U.S., we have shiny ball syndrome. It's what's the next issue. And by the way, we haven't had not making light of what's been going on recently in Afghanistan and in Syria and other parts of the world, but we really haven't had a major national security issue in the last few years, and I don't want to give short shrift to anything that's been happening, but we haven't had a World War II or an Iraq or anything of that scale. God willing, inshallah, we won't have that for a while, but we don't know. You can't bank on that we're going to let this pass and come back and fix it again. The reason why we've been nibbling around the issues in Canada, U.S., we've been doing all these things for the last 15, 20 years, 25 years to try to fix Canada, U.S., whether it's country of origin labeling or pick, Marilyn Becker's here from the consulate in Detroit who's seen more issues between Canada, U.S. than probably any human being that I know. But the reason why we get these little issues, we run from fire to fire, is we haven't had the chance. The politics haven't been there to touch NAFTA. Well, whether we wanted it or not, it's here, so now's the time to take advantage of it, in my view.
So can I take you on a detour?
And I only get 5 minutes in Washington tomorrow, so I got to get it all out today.
That's okay.
The F and NAFTA's for fun. Let's go.
That's what you're here for. I want to take you on a slight detour from the NAFTA discussion onto beyond the border discussion. You and I have been, on tour, I feel like, for how many years now, talking about beyond the border and what we had hoped the benefits were going to be from it. And, at the CBI, we often talk about the Canada-U.S. binational advantage, and I think part of beyond the border was hoping to further cement the relationship between Canada and the U.S. and improve some of the areas that there were some deficiencies in. What are your thoughts on where beyond the border will go given the NAFTA discussion, or do you see any connection or correlation there?
Well, and even beyond B2B, I think the work that CBI has been doing since its inception, and whether it's been Bill or yourself or Marta or others, what CBI has been doing in the past is shaping the present in terms of that. There's an interesting parallel between the last decade of border thickening. That phrase, I hate that phrase, to be honest with you. It's overused, but in what we're seeing in trade now. In the sense that we were talking a little bit about this a few weeks ago, and I think some of the others in the room can attest to this. People say, oh, we've never had a period this hostile in Canada, U.S. as we do right now. No, I can remember one. It wasn't right after 9/11. It wasn't when, you know, the Maritimes and things we make Broadway musicals about now and Canada, U.S. all held hands. It was Iraq, you know, and the U.S. and this border in particular. But when you look at the factors that contributed to the decade of border thickening, one was there was complacency about the pre-9/11 period, about the border. The work hadn't been done during that period of time. Now, there had been the Canada-U.S. partnership and shared border and all these other things, but in terms of actual people focused on the border day and night in the way that we see today, there wasn't a CBI, right? We didn't have data. You know, that was shocking to me when I came. I was on the U.S. side doing guns, drugs, and thugs and running a lab, and something that became the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and then came to the Canadian government and just sitting around and saying, where's the data? Everything's anecdotal evidence. Well, there wasn't it really from academia. There were pockets of it, but it was all kind of roughshod. You didn't really have a comprehensive view. And part of it was because of that complacency. The money wasn't flowing for that data. And again, I want to not look too much retrospectively, but there's an interesting comparison to today. So you didn't have a lot of data. The private sector had the data. The automotive companies can tell you where a truck is, and to some extent, any moment of the day right now. And they were pushing it, but let's face it, folks that had the data, they didn't want to share it because it's a competitive advantage. And they certainly don't want to share it with government, because then we're going to get taxed. And trust me, I'm on the dark side, again, of private law practice. We're going to give what we need to give for compliance purposes, but you ain't getting anything more than that. And then, of course, you had government itself was doing it, but you know, that's not really where a lot of, you know, data, that data is driven by what the private sector is often given. So we spent a lot of time trying to just figure out what was going on the border, and that took a few years. What was interesting is there was some great work done in the Pac Northwest and in Buffalo, Niagara. There wasn't really anything here. There were great individuals. There was some great institutions. You know, you have one of the best supply chain management programs right across the river at a couple of universities over there, but they were focused on east-west. They weren't really looking at north-south too much, or global supply chains. Nobody was really focused on how do you deal with this Canada-U.S. border, or a lot of it was viewed in the context. The data that was out there was always kind of skewed by what was happening on the U.S.-Mexico border. It wasn't until CBI came that we really had, when Bill came here, that we really started seeing an approach where we could start saying, here's some real numbers. And some, you know, that's not, again, there's a lot of folks doing it, but CBI's model is the perfect model, because now CBI reaches out to those other subject matter experts and can pull them in, so we can start getting a comprehensive view here at the border, and then that formed policy decisions. So I was joking, and so we started to seeing the border unthickening. So a lot of the dumb regulations that piled on, we were able to weed through, and we're kind of getting back to the point where the border comes down to one issue, which is frankly, or two issues. One is we need some better technology on single window and making it easier, and infrastructure. And I promise we're not going to talk about that damn bridge today. I promise we're not going to talk about that bridge.
Thank you.
We're not. You can do that in another one of these lunch and learns. But now track that to today. You know, and that launched Beyond the Border.
Right.
Because Beyond the Border came about because, you know, there were a lot of reasons for it, but enough of the trade associations and private sector said, here, look at these numbers. Look at these numbers on how many jobs that this is impacting, or look at that. To fast forward to today, you know, we gave a presentation to the governors and premiers from the Great Lakes region back in April. That slide that I was talking about that Bill Anderson has, that's where I showed that slide, because it's a heat slide that shows where our trucks crossing the Ambassador Bridge, you know, where they are, and why this should be relevant to not just folks in Detroit, Windsor, but around the Great Lakes region and beyond. I kind of tell a difference. I actually say that there's no white space on it, so that means that there's a truck everywhere, but we can talk about how I lie about that slide.
Bill is like...
So how I lie about that slide.
But it just
but those types of things sell. That's what folks like me need when we go in and meet with a member of Congress or elsewhere. You gotta make it relevant. You gotta have data. And so fast forward to today, and I'll quickly, where were you? Oh, Beyond the Border. But fast forward to today. Complacency on NAFTA. You talk to anybody that negotiated the NAFTA, what do they say? They say our biggest mistake was we got it passed through Congress, we tipped the champagne glasses, we took our flights home and said, aren't we great? And we put no mechanism in place to keep it fresh or and build that public support. So the only voices you've heard for the last 25 years on NAFTA, publicly are the anti-NAFTA folks. Because the rest of us are like, hey, this is a good thing, right? Our companies are rocking and rolling and all that. People will just understand. Well, and guess what? That anti-trade, you know, and add, you know, and I don't mean these as negatives. These are friends and family of mine, you know, anti-trade, environmental movement. We've seen on issues across the board, the non-governmental community is more mobilized in environmental than any way. They've mastered social media well before the pro-trade side has. You know, throwing stats out there that 35 U.S. states transport to Mexico, hell, they can drill it down by district. You know, they're in the local town halls targeting me with social media saying, you know how many jobs trade cost you in Columbus, blah, blah, blah. They're that good. They're that good because they have a receipt of mine that I bought a book one time about such and such. They're targeted, you know. And so all of that to say, we got complacent on the NAFTA. Also, we as the business community got complacent. We said, hey, we got this covered. We're looking at the rest of the world right now. We're looking at Europe, we're looking at Asia, we're looking at everything else. So we didn't care too much. We don't have great data on trade. We have great big numbers. We used to have how many jobs are created in your district, but really getting companies out there to tell their story is virtually impossible. Right now, that's a big issue that we're trying to do is get, because if all, you know my tagline, if all politics is local, all trade is personal, right? Everybody I know, I can throw out how many jobs are created by trade in Ohio and Michigan and all of those types of things, which are important. That's the baseline. But if I can't amplify that to say, you know, that factory that closed over there, that closed because of X, but here's 17 other companies in your neighborhood that are reliant on selling those things, exporting, or companies that came in and invested in Windsor-Essex, or you know the growers out at Leamington that are able to expand their operations into the U.S. because we do in trade. You know, those types of things. If we can't do that, if we don't have the data for it, we're going to continue to get our clock cleaned out there, and then that's why we're going to see perhaps potentially not great decisions being made on trade. Now, one comforting thing for all of the anti-Trump people in the world, or everybody that's afraid about trade, I talked about the trade team having 25 years of experience. What they have come in and done behind the scenes, it doesn't get a lot. You see the executive orders on the Muslim, so-called Muslim ban. You hear Buy America, Buy America. If you look underneath steel, aluminum, they've issued 14 executive orders and various actions that all call for studies. This administration right now is going out there and it has bureaucrats out in the world gathering data. And you know, the question is, where are they gathering it from? You know, that's why companies, that's why it's so important that there's the stakeholder process on the NAFTA so that stories can be told. Because if companies don't get engaged right now, those bureaucrats that are out there running around, where are they going to go? Who are they going to talk to? And a lot of what we've been doing is kind of steering them in directions so that we know that they're getting pressure from the top to shut, you know, it's America first. And, you know, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm an American, and there ain't nothing wrong with an America's first policy. And if I'm a Canadian, there better be a Canada first policy too. You know, I mean, that's how our systems are supposed to work, and then hopefully we can all get along. I don't mean to sing Kumbaya or anything here, but
I'm not singing with you.
there's nothing intellectually wrong with an Make America Great Again policy, but we just have to make sure data. So I think what you'll see is there's reports on supplies and deficits coming out. We just saw steel and aluminum. There's Buy America, and so you're going to see this, and that data is all being created to do one of two things. It's going to be the U.S. is going to go country by country and say, let's talk about our trading relationship. And if a country comes and says, you know, well, we create this many jobs, they're going to say, do you? Because that's not what it shows in our data right here. Or they're going to say, well, what about this other issue that we find? There's going to be no gray area in these discussions. And so while we're at it, let's have a discussion about this. Oh, you don't want to negotiate? You don't want to renegotiate with us or modernize with us? We've just unleashed, because the other thing the administration has done is unleashed a full new toolkit that we can launch on trade enforcement measures. There's a lot going on behind the scene where the U.S. can act unilaterally now to put tariffs. So if I'm Canada, what's the message for Canada? You know this is going on, that the U.S. is going to be doing this around the world. Why wouldn't I use this NAFTA moment to say, we have some pretty good stats and figures. Let's get those stories out. That's what we're all here to do. But I better be focusing my energy on the NAFTA, not on archaic issues of softwood or Chapter 19 or these things that are basically, frankly, Chapter 19, the dispute resolution in NAFTA, it doesn't work. Softwood lumber's the best example of it doesn't work. It's a 30-year-old dispute. It's a dispute settlement mechanism that's not resolving that dispute. I mean, and you can't just focus on one, and I'm a trade lawyer, we use Chapter 19 a lot. But rather than focus on that, let's look at types of things that we can put into the NAFTA that as the U.S. goes around enforcing ensures that we have preferential access. I shouldn't say we, but that Canada has preferential access with the U.S.
You're Canadian today. You're wearing the tie.
That's it. So beyond the border is one of those.
Right.
So that's a very long-winded way. So as we talk the rest of the time, that's the basic philosophy. My philosophy is if I'm Canada, if I can make some concessions, and they're going to be tough, on supply management, on softwood lumber, maybe do some things on supply management, I'm going to be able to get a hell of a lot more out of it because that's what the administration cares about. But I can maybe get beyond the border in there because if the border doesn't work, we know this for a fact, it doesn't matter what trade agreement you have. So embed beyond the border. So my thinking on this, as I talked about the T's, Canada's engagement strategy should center on the letter E. Number one is show that we're an example of what a modern 21st century trading relationship. And basically say to the U.S., we're your guinea pig. And I know that sounds like subservient in some way, but say to the U.S. and say, if you're not going to get things like the border right, or regulatory cooperation, or movement of workforce, if you ain't going to get it right with Canada, where we don't compete on labor standards or anything, you ain't going to get it right with anybody. So use us. Let's use this as a testing ground. Secondly, let's embed the things that we've done over the last 25 years, beyond the border, regulatory cooperation council. Embed those things, get them locked in because we need them as we go forward, and maybe we can talk RCC, and then talk about the enhancements. Like right now, everybody's in Washington talking about the enhancements, workforce mobility and those other things. If we don't embed those other things, it may all be moot by the time we're all said and done.
For sure.
So that's my speech. I can leave now.
Well, thank you, Dan. No, you can't leave. We don't get you here every day, and I think we'd like to open up some questions to see if the audience has any questions for Dan. There is a microphone at the back if you'd like to walk there. If not, we can pass them around to you, but we don't often have the chance to have you here with us, and to have you share your experience and your expertise with us is a great privilege for all of us. So I don't know if anyone has any questions to ask of Dan. I could ask him questions all day, so.
I would have met somebody else.
Go ahead.
Dan, what about energy?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And the president raised energy back in the spring as his list of, kind of in his tirade on Canada, and said energy, and everybody kind of paused and said, we didn't know we had an issue on energy in this administration. I think that's softened a little bit in terms of the Canada-U.S. I mean, obviously Keystone was something he did on Trump day one, which wasn't actually day one of the administration. Day one was the Friday when he was inaugurated, but he considers day one the Monday. So he's the president, he can decide what's day one. But Keystone XL came right out of the chute. Still some question marks about what steel was allowed to be used and whether he really responded. But the bottom line is Keystone was approved. So that ancient, never-ending issue kind of left us. They're stepping away from Canada-U.S. I think there's a very real issue as to U.S.-Mexico energy and North American energy. And we've been talking to the Mexicans about this for some time, in the sense that as Mexico has now done something amazing in terms of privatizing its energy sector, or privatizing, yes, its energy sector, it's now open to open bidding, which is fine. But of course, who's trying to get in there? It's not just you Americans and Canadians, or Europeans for that matter. It's Asian. And in fact, in the first round of bidding, one of the top 5 was a Chinese company. And our view, as those that consult with the Mexican government, was, how's the U.S. going to like that when the Chinese set up in the Western Hemisphere, or at least on the North American continent, and start pumping out energy from there, or beating U.S. companies? What would you expect? And that was during the Obama administration. We were saying that. What do you expect now? So I think that we're not seeing it as part of the discussions. Interestingly, it's not it was part of the Federal Register notice. It's not part of the hearings, and it may be API, American Petroleum Institute, testifying tomorrow, but it hasn't received the same resonance that I thought we would. expect, I think hydroelectric is cross-border hydroelectric cooperation. We're seeing more of that play out at the state and provincial issues. As you well know, Mary Lynn, one of the issues we had, a conservative group that advises legislators, ALEC, passed some model legislation a few years ago that said when states are doing renewable energy standards, they should implement this, X, Y, Z, and sounded very Canadian there, didn't I? But one of which was to count Canadian hydro as meeting the portfolio, or Canadian energy. And at first everybody's like, wow, this is great for Canada, US. But we called time out for a minute and said, why would a conservative group that's not known to like renewable energy be so supportive of Canadian renewable energy? Well, because renewable energy is largely subsidized by taxpayer dollars. And that's what this model legislation is. So what they wanted was taxpayer dollars going up to subsidize Canadian companies, so you can see the ad in the next election. Oh, we're paying for that Canadian electricity to come down here, and that's why renewable energy is horrible, blah, blah, blah. So you could see, you always have to be careful about those things. You know, that gets outside of the scope of NAFTA, but I think one of the great opportunities, frankly, for Canada is that while the U.S. slowly, at both the federal and state levels, is pulling back on a lot of our renewable energy programs. And that's the kind of the really untold story in the Canada-U.S. relationship is really what's happening at the state level. These are becoming rapidly gerrymandered, Republican-dominated state legislatures and governorships. The Democratic Party, keep in mind, while President Obama was president, I'm saying this not as a criticism, it's a statement of fact, was cleaned out. The bench has been largely cleaned out because the Republicans controlled state legislatures, they gerrymandered the districts, which is, you know, part of our process. And you've now had the Republican Party really take over. And I don't say that as a Republican or Democrat, I'm just saying it's a statement of look at the numbers. And so as the US pulls back, I think, on renewables, you're going to see that's a great market opportunity for Canada to continue. May not be the best idea to try to immediately go off coal by 2020. That may, in hindsight, may not have been the best decision, but I'll leave that to the voters here to decide in Ontario. But I think that there is a market opportunity there. I think the Mexican issue. I don't know how the oil sands, frankly, is going to play out. I mean, just with oil pricing where it is and where the dollar is, I don't know. I don't understand how that would come into play. I don't think it's going to be as big as folks. The president mentioned it, so somebody told him something. You know, because it's usually the last person to talk to him. That's what you hear on TV. But we don't know where that came from, and nobody's been able to answer it, frankly.
Another question?
Yeah. First, I want to thank you both for being here today. And actually, it's the first opportunity kind of publicly to say how much we appreciate having Laurie Tannous on the team at CBI now. She's been associated with us. I've often said that I learned more about the operational aspects of the border from Laurie than anybody else. And so it's great. And a lot of new things happening at CBI because of Laurie's involvement. And so it's great to have you, Laurie. And Dan, and last time we had one of these things, it was Chris Sands, and I said, you can't have a conversation about the border without Chris Sands. Well, the other person you can't have, you know, that conversation without is Dan.
For sure.
So it's really, you really couldn't have two better people here to talk about these things today. I want to talk a little bit about, I want to ask, let me ask a couple of sort of big questions that maybe you can just dismiss, okay? One question is there a chance that the United States walks away, or at least starts the process, as the president threatened to do once, towards stepping away from NAFTA in the middle of these negotiations? And the second one is sort of related. Is there a chance that things over the coming months sort of go sideways, and what we end up with is a move towards a pair of bilateral agreements?
On the first one, you know, I had mentioned back in February that keep in mind that this president and Secretary Ross, less so with USTR Lighthizer, and USTR actually has the lead on by statute on these decisions. are deal guys. You know, they make deals. And as I really looked at how the NAFTA, going back to my earlier point, the question was, would we invoke TPA 2015 fast track, or would the president try to do this alone? It made sense to me from a deal perspective to issue the 90-day letter saying that we were going to renegotiate the NAFTA, and at the same time withdraw from the agreement. And the reason was, when you withdrew from the agreement, it said you had to give at least 6 months notice, but it didn't say, you know, you have to have it done in 6 months, right? So you could say, we're out of the NAFTA. Now, it doesn't mean we're out in 6 months. It doesn't mean it's just saying our intent is we're going to withdraw. If we don't get a deal done by X date and we're issuing our intent, we're starting that process with the 90-day letter. In my view, because it made sense, it keeps if the idea was on the timing and tempo, you wanted to get this done by the end of the year, why wouldn't you? That would keep the clock on. I mean, that's a negotiating strategy. You close the doors, you turn the heat up, essentially, that's the equivalent. So I was predicting that is actually where they were going to go on it. And I think they went that. That's where Peter Navarro and I think and others were really, and I think there was a political reason for that too, that to tear it up. That all happened around the 100-day time, you know, when he wanted to be seen as doing something around 100 days. It makes some strategic sense to do it. The downside of that is the uncertainty created by it, right? So, and I think that's what the business community pushed back on, is basically said, whoa, 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 whoa. We're not going to be able to contract. And then you had people saying, we're not going to be able to attract investment into North America if we don't have an agreement governing. And there's a lot of folks that always rely on, oh, well, we have the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Keep in mind, we had a NAFTA because the Free Trade Agreement was still pretty rough around the edges at the time. It wasn't that great when it was there, and it hasn't been updated in 20-odd years. So that would have needed a lot of work. So, you know, tearing it up would have created a notice of withdrawal would have created, I think, a lot of instability in the business community. I don't think there is I'm not going to say it's 0%, but I would say it's probably in the less than 50%, less than maybe even 30% chance that we would see at some point the president get so off kilter that he would threaten to tear up the agreement. I think what you would see is, in my view, I think what would happen, and the reason for that is, let's face it, what saved Canada, as much as we'd like to think it's the automotive industry or other manufacturing supply chains, it was the agriculture community. It was that the Mexicans buy a lot of agricultural products from the U.S. I mean, all of the other factors played into the decision, but at the end of the day, you don't mess with the farm lobby in the U.S. I used to say you don't mess with the old people, you don't mess with the AARP, but their influence is waning. But you don't mess with the farm lobby, and I think they flex their muscles and would again. So what I do think, kind of related to your second question, is that specter will be out there. It will always be out there. The president's not going to relinquish that. But I think it's definitely muted at this point. But I think if we start getting stuck in the Mexican elections and the midterms and Congress and everything else, is what you will see is, hey, we tried to do this with the TPA. We tried to work with you, Congress, but we can't get that done with you. So what we're going to do is look at the things that we can do under our executive authority, which are tweaks, which are things like rules of origin and a few other things. And politics is about who gets the blame, right? You know, you could say, the president could say, look, I tried to get this done. I tried to tear up the agreement, but it's going to cost you more jobs. It's going to hurt our farmers. It was the Democrats in Congress that stopped me from doing this. So I'm doing the best that I can. They'll throw a few pieces of red meat. It may be softwood lumber. It'll be something with Mexico. And, you know, we'll start construction on the wall and call that NAFTA or something and move on with our lives. That's where I think, and frankly, there's a very real possibility is that's where we would end up on this, generally. Forget any, frankly, there's a high degree of likelihood we may end up there if you're kind of thinking about how the politics are playing out. Bilat versus trilat. Again, I think it's just the influence that Mexico has had. You know, I think they were definitely leaning toward two parallel bilaterals, that there would be parallel proceedings on the bilats. I think they've been convinced by auto and ag to not do that. But where I do think there's an opportunity is for a two-speed approach. Like, we can do beyond the border as a two-speed. I think the Mexicans would be willing to say, we recognize our border is different, why don't we try Canada first, regulatory co-op. So I think you may see kind of side agreements. And that's related to that first question too. You can see we're wheel spinning here. But I think what you may also do is see if the NAFTA starts getting stalled is kind of a series of agreements on issues. So yeah, we couldn't get it done in the NAFTA. We can deal with rules of origin, the big one, but now here's the Canada-U.S. digital agreement, right, as a separate, and maybe do it under some kind of executive authority there. I mean, we have to be prepared for all those contingencies. But we're all kind of operating. It'll be trilateral. We'll start the negotiations in August. Maybe it'll be done by the year. Maybe we don't get it done until 2019. The reality is circumstances will take over. And I think one of them is the scenario that I painted out, is it just gets jammed up. President Trump throws out some red meat, and we do get a tweak. But the problem with the tweak is it may solve the political problem. It's not going to help us in the business community.
Kay,
Yeah.
I think you had a question?
Yeah, and part of what you said here, Dan, has answered it, but what I'm seeing is a lot of fear. Of the loss that could happen, the uncertainty, and all those things that are happening. What I'm wondering is, we know the value of trade and how much volume is going back and forth. What about the loss of it? Like you were saying, one person might say, well, if that happens, we're going to lose these jobs, but what they aren't equating is how many jobs we're gained. So I guess this question is for all of you. The CBI, is that a place where you're quantifying the cost of not having some of these agreements in place, of what it would cost the U.S. or what it would cost Canada, and as part of the package? So that uncertainty, if it's quantified, becomes a strong point, right?
I think that's a great question. I know the economists are struggling with how do you, it's kind of prove a negative, right, concept. Or, they've been talking about value-added costs at times. Instead of just surplus and deficits, let's look at how agreements actually have this added value effect that's more on the positive side than the negative side. But hopefully by doing it, I think that's the very real challenge in Canada-U.S. and increasingly NAFTA is that we're kind of in a post-surplus and deficit environment. There's a level of integration here in our supply value innovation chains that you frankly can't pop open and measure. And so, I mean, you're in this business and do it as well as anybody. I think the only way you can do it is not talk about what's lost in the numbers. You have to talk about people and processes.
Well, that's what I was wondering about. You're looking at I know because I have people go back and forth with my company, but the loss of that talent being shared on both sides, coming this way or going that way, and the impact that has on companies. I don't know how you would gather that number, but there's some talent that there's a real draw on that we're kind of using as joint resources, right? If that dried right up, what impact would that have in certain industries? That's, you know what I mean?
And I think the challenge is we don't even know how to measure that we have it. And I think that may be the corollary. If I pick up the phone and call John Leslie, when he's here in Windsor, over at the Chrysler Building, or I call my partners in our Toronto office. Lawyers are a bad example because everybody assumes we're billing somebody every time we talk. But pick another profession. There's so much that just goes on in intellectual movement between Canada and the United States every day. If I pick up the phone and call Laurie, well, we're both lawyers, but we're often talking about there's a value to that, but nobody's measuring that, but that's the only way we're able to do some of the more tangible movement of goods. And so at the end of the day, I think it all comes back to what the stories are. And that's, to me, the greatest challenge, and it's part of our message on the do no harm is, I actually think Canada, U.S., and North America to some extent are the metaphorical frog in the pot of water, that the rest of the world has become more competitive over time, and that water is starting to boil a little bit. And our failure to update the NAFTA or modernize the NAFTA is eroding competitiveness in the same way that the border did. We kind of became complacent about it, but we, in Canada and the United States, we just kind of adapt, right? We don't necessarily enhance it, but we're like, okay, you hear from companies, when we were doing the border, and of course CBI hears this all, companies would say, it costs me more to figure out what the border costs me than it does to actually deal with it every day. Now that's not true for most companies. It actually wouldn't cost them that much to figure it out, and then they could do that. But I think we see the same thing. That's our biggest challenge in the business community right now. That's our biggest challenge on the plus side, right? If I have a company, 70% of first-time exporters in the U.S. go to Canada, 80% of them don't call a lawyer, accountant, or banker before they do it, right? They just do it, and they're like, oh shit, we're in a different country.
Then they mess it up.
Then they screw it up.
Then they call us to fix it.
But yet, if they're going to China, they're going to have a team of
Right.
consultants
Right.
advising
In
them.
place, for
And
sure.
this isn't a pitch for consultants. So but just conceptually, we don't think about Canada that way. So most companies are saying, so our larger companies are saying, hey, NAFTA, on the hierarchy of stuff I have to deal with every day, I got operations in China, India. I'm dealing with whether my people are getting shot, or whether the government's going to come in and expropriate my facility. Doing business here, there's things we could fix, but there's only so many hours in a day. But meanwhile, that's been eroding our competitiveness, I think, in a lot of ways. And so I think you used the perfect word. The F in NAFTA right now stands for fear, not fun, right? And if there's a fear factor, but I think in some crazy way we could actually utilize, President Trump may be the best thing that's happened. If there's media here, please talk to me before we put that quote in the paper. But President Trump may be the best thing that's happened to the Canada-U.S. and North American relationship, because it's given us the opportunity to say we better stop and talk about this. The challenge is for companies thus far, it's been, we got so much other stuff to deal with right now. I don't have time to get engaged on NAFTA. I'm worried about health care. I'm worried about, and if I'm an importer-exporter, I'm worried about border adjustment tax, and that still hasn't gone away yet. For people that are getting complacent on that issue, just keep in mind that, one, it's not gone away. I mean, I don't think we'll see it in the current version, the border adjustment tax, but we'll see. They're the only way to make the tax reform work. The entire reason why we're focused on health care in the U.S. right now, maybe a small percentage, is repeal and replace Obamacare for those voters, but it's because this Congress has one job to do in terms of its support. It's to get a tax cut. And the Speaker Ryan has spent his adult life trying to get a tax cut. And the only way you make the numbers work is if you get the savings from health care and you have some kind of border adjustment tax of some type, right? And if we're not going to get health care, and we kind of saw yesterday how difficult that's going to be, where do you think the money's going to come from to get a tax cut? It's a lot easier for me to say, we're going to tax those foreigners that want to import here. So I think, folks, that there's a complacency about it now. I think that'll ramp back up in a minute. So again, I think the fear, your question really touched on, I think, the fundamental question that we're facing right now.
Any other questions for Dan or I?
And from a standpoint of, let's say, the political optics, you just brought it up about health care in the United States. It was Obamacare, bad name, got to get it over to a Republican health care system. How important, once we get to real discussions, we've got that passed us, we've got a health care plan in the United States that's functioning, whether it's functioning properly or not, but it's given the tax cuts to the American population. Once you get into really the optics of NAFTA and all the statements by Trump during the campaign and post-campaign on NAFTA's bad, and we didn't get a fair deal, and we're going to negotiate, but now we're negotiating NAFTA, we're going to try and repair it. How important is it to really the populace that he eliminate the name NAFTA? So we go down the trail as we negotiated health care, and the important objective was get rid of Obamacare. How important is it going to be to go down that trail, get to the end of it, and say, well, we tried to negotiate NAFTA, we couldn't. Mexico and Canada wouldn't work with us because they don't believe in make America great again and make Canada and Mexico poor again. You get to the stage where NAFTA blows up and we're back into bilateral negotiations on each country. And does it make sense before you start to do bilateral negotiations from the very beginning?
No, I think that's a great question, and it goes, the bilat, trilat issue, again, I go back to, I think the level of integration across sectors, not just automotive, manufacturing, but agriculture, et cetera, that's where the don't go backward comes into. I don't think we can unpack it, to be honest with you. So in terms of, there may be areas where we are more bilateral than trilateral, but I think that will be very difficult to do. In my view, the administration wanted to go to bilats. And I'll leave it to others to comment what Canada's views may have been on that as well. I think it's interesting that as Mexico became more successful in its NAFTA advocacy, you saw Canada get closer to Mexico. And I think that that was a very good strategic decision because Mexico, as I said, saved the day. But you raise a great point, Colin. I've actually been a proponent. I didn't put it in my submissions, but I'm not sure we should call the next version of this the NAFTA. You know, you're sitting to one of the great marketing and communications people next to you. I've said this in meetings and have been asked to leave NAFTA stakeholder groups because what I say is if my clients came to me and put all of the issues surrounding the NAFTA on a table, we would be in a rebranding exercise tomorrow in the private sector. It is a near fatally damaged brand. The word, you know, NAFTA. That's why I kind of joke about the F in NAFTA is for fun. But, you know, the reality is, but NAFTA to Canadians means it's agreement with the United States. NAFTA in Mexico. And in Mexico, it means it's agreement with the United States and Canada. In the United States, it means China immigration and everything else wrong with trade. But that can actually work to an advantage here. If this administration is seen as doing on things with China immigration and others, it may create some white space to actually get something done on NAFTA on a much broader level, mindful of the time, and Laurie's squirming over here.
He knows me.
She knows how to hint. Is that I think we speak about trade in the wrong way. You know, there ain't a politician around in a company around, and frankly, your average person on the street that doesn't want to support exporting. And actually, I'm not a huge fan of that word. Find more customers overseas. So when we talk about these things, and we try sometimes when we talk about trade, talk about cutting barriers, cutting red tape, those types of things, but we should talk about it in terms of finding customers. That this NAFTA is about finding customers in Canada and the United States. It's also about there ain't a politician around that doesn't love cutting a ribbon when a new company, and they don't care if you're Canadian and Mexican or from whatever country. I mean, we just Select USA, the big US initiative that brings companies from around the world into Washington. Make America Great Again, they were right there. Secretary Ross and others with a couple thousand companies from around the world that want to invest here. We don't care where you're from as long as you hire American workers, right? I mean, so to the extent that we can pitch the NAFTA as an investment attraction tool, but I actually think, you know, and we could talk, I think what we're seeing in the administration, and maybe this is a great closing point, is in that tone and tenor, this administration has picked up that the public will support a view of a North American region. In the sense of, people kind of know that, all right, we can deal with Mexico, but we just don't want it to be the damn Chinese, any more of our companies going there. And that's not an ethnic, I just certainly don't mean it that way at all. What I mean is, we know that there's somebody out there trying to eat our lunch. And it used to be Japan, but now it's China. And we don't have, what I would actually suggest is, what's missing in this debate, if I'm trying to sell this or other advocates in the room, we don't have a boogeyman, right? It's pretty easy to sell North America when I can say it's us against them, against the rest of the world. The problem is, we need them too. In the US, they're holding all of our bonds, you know, so that's a big problem. There's national security issues with Korea, North Korea, and other issues. Canada's in a very tricky situation, I think, vis-a-vis China. I said in Vancouver a few months ago that Canada should stop negotiating a free trade agreement with China today. Stop. The optics are terrible of it. And I was booed off the stage because of the impact, the importance of that to that region. And that's not just in Vancouver. That's in Saskatchewan, Alberta, and everywhere else that's saying we're getting handed our lunch by the Kiwis and the Aussies. I say that with affection, by the way. So, you know, we have to deal with that issue of, but it's not always an either or. In life, nothing's either or. You know, what we can do is maybe pace our trade with China a certain way. And that's where I go back to holding Canada, US up as the gold standard. Canada's done some really good things for the United States. Again, we don't compete on wages, et cetera. We're looking at aligning regulations. If I'm Canada, I should be selling to the US. Hold us up as your golden boy or girl. And tell all these countries around the world, if they want a trade agreement with you, they should be like us. And by the way, while we're here, we want this, 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 and this. That would be kind of my negotiating strategy right now, but you know, I think there are people advising PMO and elsewhere that wear some battle scars of the free trade agreement, and we got to let softwood go. We got to let it go. It's 30 years in the making. Get it done already. You know, it's great for my business. It ain't great for the Canada-U.S. relationship. And when you look at just where the small number of disputes we have between Canada and U.S., if you look at where they are, they're the areas where we haven't integrated fully yet. You know, Canada, U.S., NAFTA works in terms of management of disputes. It's the areas where we've been kind of hesitant, and why isn't, you know, we've integrated in softwood lumber more than we were the last time a deal was done. But the fact is there's only so many places the trees grow, right? You know what I mean? So there are certain reasons. There's only so many places on agriculture where you're going to, you know, where you can have chickens and pigs and all that. I live out in the rural market. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio. I never seen a chicken in my entire life outside of on a grill. I never knew roosters crowed. I have them in my neighborhood now. I never knew that. I thought they just crowed in the morning. They crow all day, damn day long. Who knew that? I've killed more roosters in the last month. No, I'm kidding. But these things, they just don't stop. But again, they're only in certain parts of the world. So I think the message here is that it is working, and I actually think there's a great opportunity here if we play our cards right.
Well, on that note, on behalf of the CBI, I would like to thank you, Dan, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. We wish you all the best at your hearing tomorrow, and definitely keep us posted on how it goes. And
I got nothing else to say tomorrow.
Well, no, now this was your
now
rehearsal.
I got released.
This was the rehearsal.
I did my
you
clear.
know?
My wife
so now
works
you'll
for
be
Lululemon.
focused
I got
tomorrow,
clear.
you know, so you're good. We want to thank all of you for coming here today. Definitely appreciate your attendance. Stay tuned on our website for updates and additional reports and future speaker series. So thank you very much.